So welcome everybody, and I'm thrilled to welcome our guest speakers who are Veronica Romero and Alex Paxton, the people that I met as students, but I always learned a lot from the earliest moments I've seen you. I mean, you guys knew much more than I could probably ever know on measuring synchronization, measuring complementarity, synergies, and also dynamical systems approach in general to human interaction. So I'm really, really very happy that we found this topic, which is so much in common. I know we have a lot of things in common, but this one is amazingly similar. And the talk will be about the various modes of interaction mediated by various information available. And the floor is yours. Maybe I will add one more thing, that you are part of the Train Chris lecture series, so it's also something that allows us to make those seminars. Okay.
Great. Hello, welcome. Alex and I wanted to tell you a little bit about our latest project together, which I believe most of you read the pre-registration of. So we'll give you sort of a very quick version of the background and the methods, because it's exactly what we said we would do. And then Alex is going to review the results that are currently under review for our stage 2 publication. And then we'll talk a little bit about future steps, which I think we have a lot to talk about with you guys, given your latest project as well. So what we wanted to study was how COVID basically changed the ways in which we interact with each other, because really when we think about our communications, we are taking so many things into account, like being so used to just communicating face-to-face, and then all of a sudden having to switch to technology-mediated settings, and how this might affect different parts of our communication. And so to begin, we went back and tried to look at what people had done in the past, and it was very little. Most of it was in a face-to-face setting. And so generally thinking about interpersonal coordination and the amount of information that we have available about each other in a face-to-face setting changes completely when we have technology-mediated or video conferencing communication. And so generally what we find is pre-COVID that people tend to become more similar over time. They tend to coordinate their movements with each other, and that this coordination seems to improve the social feelings and feelings of rapport with others. And so what we knew from then is that both social and physical factors tend to shape the level of interpersonal coordination and the dynamics of the coordination that arises over time. And again, that they tend to shape each other. And so when we have this lack of shared physical space, we had found previously that there's sort of this reduction to closeness, cooperation, and interpersonal coordination. However, having COVID, everything shifted, and we were curious to see how that affected the ways in which we communicated, not only socially, but also in other settings that were not as studied previously. And so again, most of our research is based on looking at a lot of face-to-face naturalistic conversation pre-COVID, and then some IO literature that showed us that when people use phone calls or video conferencing, that the communication just wasn't as great. But this specific the specific situation in which we are comparing face-to-face to video conferencing was not existent. So we decided this is a great time to fill that gap. So in our present study, we really wanted to think about how our new normal of COVID communication changed the way in which we communicated differently in different modes of communication. So our first question is, does video conferencing change interpersonal coordination patterns? Where we can look at how people interact both face-to-face and in video conferencing settings. And in our current study, we decided to actually look at two different types of video conferencing settings, and I'll get into that in a minute, okay? And so we're looking at communication media as well as different types of conversation, okay? And our initial question was, does the changes that we see or we expect to see in interpersonal coordination, will those stem from decreased visual information and lower social connection? Again, from previous research, we find that there's this lower social connection in a video conferencing setting. So we wanted to see if that was tied to interpersonal coordination. And so we had participants come into the lab, and each pair of participants was able to pick which way they were going to communicate with the other person. We did this because when we started our data collection, the US was still very much in COVID abatement measures. So all of the data collection was done at Colby College, and at the time when we started, everyone was required to wear a mask at all times, and we were using the 6 feet separation method. And a lot of the students were given the option to attend classes remotely or in person. So we wanted to make sure that participants were comfortable in whatever they were doing, and if they were not comfortable going to a face-to-face situation, that they could pick a video conferencing situation, okay? And so some dyads chose to come in and communicate face-to-face, and my computer seems to have broken up. All right, face-to-face, sitting 6 feet apart, wearing masks. Some students chose to come in person, but communicate via video conferencing. The way we did this was my lab has 3 separate rooms, and we set them up sort of like a video conference done for work, right? Where you have a person talking to someone else and there's a projection in a wall. And here we also manipulated how much information the person was getting. So in the video conferencing lab situation, they were able to see the whole person's torso and part of their legs. Mm. And then the third group were those students who really did not feel comfortable, and they were allowed to do it remotely. So they did their video conferencing in their own personal computers, and we gave them instructions on how to do this and how to set it up so that the movement data would be usable for us. And I'll get into a little bit of that. Now, each of those pairs, right, anybody who came face-to-face, lab, and remote, then had 3 separate conversations. An affiliative conversation where they talked about things that they liked, and this could be music, books, TV shows, movies, and they were told to find things that they had in common and then talk about why they liked those things. They also were asked to have an argumentative conversation, and this we did based on Alex's previous studies. They filled out a big questionnaire asking them about their opinions and the strength of those opinions about different political and social topics. Like, for example, in the States, the legal drinking age is 21, and we asked them, should we lower that drinking age to 18? And we had them have a conversation where they had not only differing opinions about the question, but also they felt very strongly about that opinion. And they were told, talk about what your opinion is, and then try to convince the other of you coming to your side. The third conversation we called cooperative or task-based, and we told them, oh, pretend that you're going to be in a stranded in an island all by yourselves, and all you can bring with you is a shoebox worth of stuff between the two of you. So discuss what you would like to bring, and you have to agree on every item, and then you have to come up with that list, okay? Our hypotheses, again, based on very limited previous studies, was that we would expect higher coordination to be present during face-to-face interaction because people were able to see the other person fully in a naturalistic setting. And we expected the lowest amount of interpersonal coordination to come from the remote video conferencing situation, because most people, as we're sitting right now, are only showing their face and part of their shoulders. So we thought, okay, less information, less coordination. In terms of conversation type, we thought affiliative conversations would lead to higher coordination. And then we would have we didn't actually expect differences between argumentative and cooperative, but we did expect those to be lower in coordination. We were able to collect 69 usable pairs. And I say usable because we collected a lot more that were not usable, and I'll get into that in a little bit. They were all undergraduates at Colby. They were mostly actually strangers to each other, which was a big change for a Colby population, something that we think gives context to our results as well. Each of the conversations that they had lasted between 8 and 10 minutes. And what we did was extract the movement from the video using frame-to-frame differencing method. So basically, this is what the setup looked like. In face-to-face, again, you see each participant sitting 6 feet apart, wearing masks. Everybody was seated throughout the study. The VC remote, as you can see, it depends on where students were sitting. And then the VC lab, you can see they have most information. In all these settings, especially in VC lab and face-to-face, they never saw their self-image. It is just the other person. With VC remote, we told them to get rid of their self-view. Of course, we're not 100% sure they did or not. But these are the videos that we then analyzed to extract movement data. All right, so for the face-to-face, we split the screen in half. Participants never crossed the midline. So in a frame differencing method, we know that any of the movement in the background is static. So any movement or any change from one frame to the next implies that the participant is moving. And we were able to extract, I don't know why that is not showing up, movement time series for each. So the reason why we had to collect so much data is because many students did not follow our directions for the remote situation, and they would sit in front of a window where, for example, a cloud might come in and there's lighting changes, which is not the kind of change that we need. And so there were some of those that we could not use. We had some problems with a couple of participants in the VC lab because there was some flickering in one of our projectors for a couple of participants, but mostly with the remote video conferencing setting, we had to be very careful about them not moving their computer and things like that. And so some of those pairs we could not use. All right. So our analyses were nonlinear time series analyses. We used cross-recurrence quantification analysis on the movement time series that we had from each pair of participants, where we would take the participant on the right of the frame versus the participant on the left of the frame. And we would reconstruct that face space. And we would create our CRQA plot and calculate some of what we would call interaction level metrics, where, as you can see, where we have the diagonal line is what they would be doing synchronously at the same time during that conversation. And we can capture also when there's a lag of a behavior, so who could be leading or following those movements. And what we did was set up the same set of parameters for every single participant, so we can compare recurrence rate, which we would think of as the general coordination, interpersonal coordination, or the inverse of noise, the determinism, which tells us about the stability or the structure of coordination, and max line, which tells us about the extractor strength of that coordination. We did also another analysis, but I'm going to let Alex go through our interaction level metrics results first. And Alex, you should be able to actually control the slides I gave you.
I saw that. That is incredible. So thank you. Okay, so as Vero described, we had kind of set up all of these different sorts of hypotheses that we then tested using linear mixed effects models, where there's more details at the bottom of every one of the result slides so that you can kind of see how we constructed those. But I'm going to really take this at more of a high level so that you can see the interpretation of what we found, but we're more than happy to talk more about it in more detail in the questions. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll be able to see the plots. So they're going to be displayed with a face-to-face laboratory condition at the top, then video conference remote in the middle, and video conference laboratory at the bottom. The y-axis for this will be the dependent variable. In this case, we're going to start with the recurrence rate, which again is general coordination, or the inverse of noise. And then affiliative is going to be on the left-hand column, argumentative in the middle column, and cooperative on the right-hand column there. Affiliative is always going to be shown in blue, argumentative always in red, and cooperative always in gray. So what we first found is that, contrary to our hypotheses, we found that there was higher coordination as measured by log recurrence rate in argumentative and cooperative conditions. Again, that is contrary to what we had expected based on previous research, where consistently in personally held argumentative conversations, we see lower coordination relative to friendly conversations. And the reason why we took the log of recurrence rate is because it was it helped to normalize the distribution, but we can talk more about that later. So here, what we'll see is plots. These are going to be displayed as plots where you can see both the individual points as well as the shape of the distribution. So here you've got all of the plots, the three different conditions, and just so that you're aware, kind of oriented, the face-to-face laboratory and affiliative conditions were the reference categories for our analyses. So we also found when we're looking at determinism, so this is again now determinism is on the y-axis. The range is truncated just for the plots. We did include the whole range for them, but just to kind of show you a little bit more of the detail, we truncated the plots so that you didn't see the a couple of outliers, so you kind of see the meat of that distribution. Again, for determinism, we found, contrary to our expectations, that there was more structured coordination as indicated by higher determinism in both the argumentative and cooperative conditions and conversations, and in the VC lab medium relative to face-to-face conversations. So again, not exactly what we expected. So here are those plots for you: face-to-face lab, VC remote, and VC lab conditions here. So what we are seeing with these two is, again, not supporting the hypotheses that we had expected. So then the last one, looking at maximum line length. So again, that's the indicator of attractor strength. What we found is, again, contrary to expectations, that there was a more stable attractor as indicated by higher max line in argumentative conversations, with no effect of medium there. So here you've got all three of those. conditions and all three of the conversation types and all three of the communication media there. So in looking at these, we, were a little bit surprised because there was no significant effect. So not only did a lot of these individual metrics of interpersonal coordination not shake out with the hypotheses that we had, constructed based on the previous work in this area, combining the pieces that had been already done, that had gone through the stage 1 registered report and gotten feedback on that. So that was surprising. But we also found that there was no significant effect of conversation type or communication medium on any of the subjective outcomes, which was surprising given again previous literature suggesting that those feelings of closeness are really strongly tied to the way that we're having interactions with one another. That physical co-presence of being in the same room with people really does have an impact. So we found then this clear evidence that there is something happening in these different kinds of conversations that people are having in these different media in which they're having them, but not as we predicted. So what we wanted to do is dig more deeply into the data to see what might be happening, because there's clearly an effect, but it's not as we predicted. So to do this, we did a series of exploratory analyses where we wanted to kind of look at, kind of better understand the data and see what the data were telling us. So one of the things that we found as we were going back to previous literature and trying to really kind of grapple with what we might be seeing is that an earlier paper that Rick Dale and I had done, the first paper where we looked at these argumentative and affiliative conversations, there was a trend towards an effect of conversation order. In other words, when people have different kinds of starting points for their relationships as strangers, it changes the way that they experience their conversation. That as people kind of look at that scope of the way that they have gotten to know their conversation partner, that it can have real impacts on the way that those interaction dynamics unfold. So what we decided to do was to break down the data that we had collected and honor that that understanding of how people are kind of interacting with each other. So what we did first is we looked at these exploratory analyses, looking at these different ratings of closeness with people based on these different interaction settings. And so we looked at the differences in the dyad's history as their social dynamics in each of the conversations that they had. So when we look at these here, this is going to be a busy plot, and I'm going to try to orient you just to a little bit, just at first, but this is recurrence rate. Again, this is looking at the overall conversation, kind of the conversation coordination metric that we have. So we have conversation order now also included on this, where the first conversation is in purple, the second conversation is in green, and the third conversation is in yellow. We're going to have our affiliative, argumentative, and cooperative conditions as the columns. And then we're going to have the face-to-face laboratory, VC remote, and VC lab as the rows. So what I'm going to call your attention to here is the reference category. Again, the reference category is the affiliative and face-to-face, which is the one that's highlighted up in the top corner. And then the other conversation, the other interaction that came out as being significant here at the bottom, where there's significant interaction, there's a significant interaction predicting post-conversation ratings of closeness, where with log recurrence rate by VC lab conditions, so that's when they can see all of each other, but they're on video conference, in argumentative conversations. And so what we find is that there is this evidence of hysteresis where there are these differences in ratings of closeness when people have these different sorts of interactions at these different levels. That, in other words, when people start their conversation in one kind of setting, that has a significant impact in the way that they experience each of those other conversations. So when we look at the data and look at those interactions that we were anticipating to see in this social interaction outcomes, the social kind of feeling outcomes, when we ignored the temporal data from that, we really were missing out on some of the effects that were happening, whereby we see the fingerprints of the dyads' past conversations on their present. So we also did an analysis of these moment-to-moment interactions through the diagonal recurrence profiles. So what we kind of going back to our toy example of the recurrence plot that we would have constructed. Again, this is just for the sake of demonstrations. This is assuming more of a categorical data profile. We did continuous recurrence, but this is just going to kind of orient you to what's happening here. So we take the recurrence plot, and from that we can extract the diagonal recurrence profile. So while we had here at lag 0 at the diagonal in the recurrence plot, in other words, saying that that's simultaneity is the point of simultaneity where time for the person on the right is equal to time for person on the left. So it's time as it really exists. That is indicated and the center of the diagonal recurrence profile, and increasing lags comes out from that point. So that what we can then do is measure the amount of filled in points relative to all points at each of those lags and get indications of how those how the interactions are not just happening overall, but how those coordination dynamics are unfolding moment to moment. So what we can then do is we can quantify those diagonal recurrence profiles and extract measures of synchrony by describing the quadratic fit of the line. So whether, how kind of peaked it is, because if people are engaging more in moment-to-moment synchrony, we should expect to see higher amounts of synchrony in that lag 0 point and then drop off after that. We can also capture leading and following dynamics by seeing how well described that plot is by a linear fit. So we can see if someone is leading, then it'll have one slope, and if the other person is leading, it will have another slope. And I'm kind of breezing through this because I know y'all have used recurrence metrics, but if you have any additional questions, please feel free to follow up. I'm more than happy to go into more detail. So when we look at the different patterns we might expect to see in diagonal recurrence profiles, we might describe a few different prototypical patterns. We might expect to see something that looks like this. So at the top, what you'll see is the example data set as collected, again, which is with just toy data, assuming this is categorical only rather than continuous, but it does help for our purposes to kind of simplify what we're looking at. And at the bottom, you'll see the diagonal recurrence profile for that. So what if we tend to see something where there's a peak at lag 0 and a drop off around that point, that's indicating synchrony or coordination, where people are more likely to be engaging in the same behavior at the same time relative to being, kind of distributed in time. Another pattern we might expect to see is this second one, which is where there is the kind of trough or the lowest point of synchrony, the lowest point of recurrence at lag 0 that would increase later. And we would call that asynchrony or turn taking. This is where people are less likely to be engaging in the same behavior at the same time, but with a lag, they will be doing the same thing. So the synchrony and coordination pattern tends to describe people's body movement as they're engaging with one another, whereas asynchrony tends to describe turn-taking patterns of conversation. And if you think about this based on the ways that those two are working, we can both be talking and having a productive conversation and be moving at the same time. But when we're having a conversation and trying to exchange information verbally, then, well, we can't both be talking at the same time. So instead, I have a turn, I'm quiet, and then you take the turn instead. So that's what that would be describing. The last pattern that we might look at is where there's no clear relationship between them. So there's some kind of noise where there's, kind of moving around that, but no clear peak or trough at that 0 point. And any of these could be offset on one side or the other, indicating that there's a synchrony pattern or a turn-taking pattern, but someone is leading that. In other words, someone is kind of engaging in something, and then someone else follows them into it. So we did analyses where we were looking at these different kinds of face-to-face interactions And what we wanted to do with these is look at the differences that we were testing before, but in the kind of moment-to-moment dynamics. So here we're going to have, again, that same kind of setup, face-to-face lab at the top, then VC remote in the middle, and VC lab at the bottom. Recurrence rate is going to be on our y-axis, but again, this is only during the window that we're looking at. So we're looking at a plus or minus 3-second window as measured in 10 hertz lag. So at the bottom, you'll see the lag there. And again, to orient you, synchronous behavior would be along the middle, and then that's real time as they're engaging it, and then out is with those lags. So when we look at these behaviors, again, to orient you to the results that we found from the whole plot interactions, those are above, but then this bottom one is our interaction that we have here. We found that there was more tightly coupled synchrony in argumentative remote video conference conversations and cooperative lab video conferencing conversations relative to affiliative and face-to-face conversations, with more of a leader-follower dynamic in the cooperative lab conditions. So here our plots are displaying the colors of the conversation. Gray is cooperative, red is argumentative, blue is affiliative. So here are the three that we have. So the kinds of behaviors that we have here, you can see this again in especially in video conference remote and video conference lab, there is that clear peaked synchrony that is kind of characteristic of body movement. But surprisingly, we see that argumentative conversations, again, relative to the affiliative conversation in the face-to-face lab condition, we do see this tighter coupling of synchrony in the lab, and in the remote. VC is kind of different in the coupling there, and in the VC lab condition, the cooperative condition is. So we also see this very interesting sort of pattern in the face-to-face lab condition, where the data are described, pretty well by these flat interactions, but you can see this sort of rhythmicity happening in the underlying data. So what we're seeing here is the individual aggregate points with standard error around each of those. As the ghostly lines in the background, you can see kind of the raw data, as well as the best fit linear and quadratic fits of those lines in darker colors around them. So there's this interesting behavior that we want to dig more into about what's happening with this kind of rhythmic behavior happening in the face-to-face lab condition, but we're still looking into it. We did do a lot of data quality checks, and it based on everything does not appear to be an artifact of anything that we're actually any of our data processing or anything. It seems to be something happening there. We have some ideas, we can talk about it later, but there you have it. So I'm going to turn it over now to Vero for the discussion and future directions.
Great. So as Alex mentioned, let's come back to our original question. How does video conferencing change interpersonal coordination? We had some hypotheses to begin with based on the limited previous data, which were not supported by our current data set. We do find that conversation type and communication medium both shape those patterns, but they are not in the ways we had predicted before, which led us to think about what it is that might explain some of these patterns that we see, right? So one of the reasons why we think that the patterns we were expecting were not patterns that we saw is the actual effects that the COVID-19 pandemic had in our social interactions, in our social context. So initially, when we talked about that previous research, most people were not very familiar with the use of video conferencing technology. They were mostly used to having face-to-face conversations in which they could see someone else's not only whole body, but their faces. And in this case, we have students who finished high school online, who now have conversations with their friends through video a lot more often than we ever did. And so we're thinking about this idea of how COVID actually changed the ways in which we communicate and how those might be the patterns that we're looking at. Part of our future questions in the ways in which we want to look at our data is to actually separate it into the time in which the participants participated, to see if some of that can be seen, sort of those in the initial study being less comfortable in video conferencing versus those at the end. It's one of the ideas we have. Initially, we thought that the most important thing would be amount of information that we had about the other participant. And now we're also thinking that it's not only how much information you have, but the type of information that we have. So unlike your study, when we had them interact face-to-face, all of our participants were wearing masks. And we just thought, okay, we're losing a little bit of information, but maybe that's a really important information that we need. And so going forward, we should think about not only the amount of information, but also the type or the kind of information that is being lost when using different abatement measures. We also cannot ignore the fact that participants were the ones picking how to interact with others. So this self-selection bias might be playing a role here. The fact that maybe we got people feeling more comfortable in video conferencing, picking video conferencing communication made it so that this interpersonal coordination was just more comfortable for them, and that shows up in our data. And so we have been toying with the idea of manipulating this more in the lab. So bringing people in and doing the levels of amount of information in the lab, but everybody having the same setting, and playing with wearing a mask and not wearing a mask also face-to-face and in video conferencing to, again, really dig into these reasons why we think our data is different. Sort of tied to that, how comfortable we are with the conversation and the context broadly. Again, we might find that participants who are interacting in the remote video conferencing, they get to pick where they have these conversations with friends versus the other participants who are in a lab setting, which will change their behavior. And so again, trying to manipulate that in a more systematic way is going to be, I think, really important for us to understand the patterns of results that we received. And the last thing, this is, I think, our struggle in interpretation came from this idea that the argumentative conversations seem to be sort of this real surprise for us, right? We thought, okay, face-to-face, yes, you have all this information, but covering the mouth is really important. But why argumentative conversations versus affiliative or cooperative? Why do they show so much interpersonal coordination? And this is something we're still trying to grapple with. But our thought right now is that actually, again, going back to the context of when we collected our data, our participants were in this very difficult social context where everything had changed, and they were feeling very lonely and separate from peers and family. And so this idea that they were having a conversation about topics that they felt strongly about, we think might have had a play into this, right? So you can talk about books, but maybe if books are not something that you love talking about, that affiliative conversation, yes, it will be pleasant, but you won't put your whole self into this, right? Whereas in an argumentative conversation where we know you have an opinion and that opinion is held strongly, you might put more yourself into it. And specifically the age of our participants lead us to this other component of the way in which they interact with each other that might be different from how we do it, which is this idea of authenticity, of being your authentic self and having difficult conversations and pointing those things out that make us think that maybe that's why they felt more comfortable in an argumentative situation. this idea of having a conversation that was authentic and useful rather than, oh, what was the last Netflix show that you saw? And so this connection that they were making just might have felt just stronger for them. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to figure out. And in doing that, we have some ideas for future steps that I mentioned before. There are some ideas of collecting more data to tease out these differences, but we also have all of this data that we get to look at now. One of the things that we are working on currently, and I'm going to actually be presenting at CRQA a poster of a subset of this data. We're going to look at the linguistic alignment of these different conversations and how the context and type of conversation affect it. So we're in the process of preparing all of the full data set to look at that. We have a very small data set for CRQA. Like I said, we do want to do this new study where we manipulate mask wearing. We think this is something that's key here that we really should understand better. We don't think that masks are completely going away, and it's really important to really understand what the effect of that is. And then our other future step, which I've been in contact with you guys recently, is we were wondering, given the very different setups that we had in our two projects, if one of the reasons why our data might have been different would be this movement extraction method. Because the way I understand it, you guys use OpenPose software for your study. And our data is sort of this very abstract whole body movement measure that we're looking at versus a more honed in understanding of where that interpersonal coordination might be happening. So for example, the nose and the torso, or the neck that you guys use. So we are hoping to talk to you all about your study. So we were very excited about this opportunity because we were thinking, well, what if we take our data and use OpenPose and try to look at what is going on there and see if the same patterns of results hold for our original data set, or it is that we're just capturing a different type of coordination in terms of whole body rather than a more targeted approach. And so that's our current future step. I have a couple of students working with me on that, and I would love to talk about any ideas you might have or suggestions. And so one of the easier things we can do right away is take our data and extract this movement differently and then recompare things. And again, we can talk about it a little bit more at the end. But before we wrap up, we do have some people to thank. I do have some great undergraduate students who helped us collect most of the data. Unfortunately, they're all either graduated or graduating on Saturday, so they'll be leaving me. And then Jay Dixon and Dimitri and Wim, who helped us sort of really think about this problem in the very early stages as we were preparing our stage 1 pre-registry. So that was in 2021, right? Yeah, beginning of 2021. It's been a while.
I think it was fall 2020.
That's when you and I started sort of talking, and then
yeah.
We started writing the proposal. I think it was January. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
2 years. Yep. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.